So what we're doing is we're sewing a shape, two curves. We've done the pattern where we just drew the line and the bust dart's been pivoted in here into this section here, which is why they're not quite the same size circles, because this element there from this point has actually got the bust dart on it. That's the bust dart there. Well, it's a small mini sample, so 1 centimetre seam allowance is actually quite large, but it's just getting the principle of joining the curves. It's not easy. So you want as many marks as you've got. So we've got the notches, which will correspond. I've also put these little like drill holes, so dots, to help line up with the end of the seam allowance here. And I've done the seam allowance staggered, so this does look longer than this one, but I know that they match when I do them. Now when you're sewing two curves, because of the way circles work and adding seam allowance, this sewing line is exactly the same length. If I walk that around, that's the same length, so I know that they match. However, when we add the seam allowance on this edge, this is a longer length than when we add this becomes smaller, because that's an inner diameter and that becomes bigger, an external one. So the two outside edges don't match. You have to remember that. But at the 1 centimetre seam allowance they do. So we're still putting right sides together, and you've got to walk it around. So it all gets a little bit tricky. So you'll probably need to snip it before you go. So these points are important for lining them up. So matching those points together. That's important. And then it's all about matching at the sewing line. You can see it doesn't feel like it wants to meet, but where my notches go together, they will meet. And then I've got this very tight inner curve and a very long outer edge. And that's the problem, people stretch one fit the other. So this one will become wavy, but this one will need to snip. Now you need sharp scissors, which I don't have. So I would suggest on the one that's got the smaller inner curve, that up to your 1 centimetre seam allowance, you need to know which is your notches, so make sure that they are with, not with biro, but with tailor's chalk or something. These are just sewn sample. You know the difference between your notches and when you're going to snip the fabric, because they're two different things. Because to allow this outer edge to open, you need to snip it so that it can lay flat on its sewing line. Without snipping that, and I'm only going up to the 1 centimetre seam allowance, I'm not going past it, that's now going to allow me to open that edge out easier, just to even pin them on together. So right sides together, matching all of the relevant points. So that's that little drill hole there. Start there, and then my notches. Now this, you can see, opens up, and at the actual sewing line they will match. So it's important that I just pin them at the notches, and that sewing line will be flat sewing. It's going to feel a little bit awkward, yeah, and it doesn't matter if you sew from this one or this one. You might find it easier sewing this way up, because you can then guide and make sure that that's not going to be puckered, but you want to make sure that you've got your notches matched. And then pin on the actual 1 centimetre seam allowance. So you're still matching the outside edges, but you're pinning it at the sewing line itself, which allows movement and no puckering. It will ease a little bit, but you can, we've done quite a tight curve. Into my, just to demonstrate it's not easy. It's going to go all the way around like this, so making sure I know which are my notch lines and matching those two up, and again matching at the outside edges. And this is where it's really important with your seam allowances that they are all accurate, because without correct seam allowances it's not going to fit. It's that panic of it doesn't match on the outside edge, it's not going to, it's matching at the sewing line that's important. Alright, and then going around, I seem to have missed a couple of notches out there. That's why it's important. Look, I missed that notch there out. So that one goes to there. That's why it's important to have everything marked on your work and trust that your pattern is correct when you're doing it. So it looks tight, yeah, when you're doing it and sewing it, but it will work, right, as long as your pattern is accurate and your cutting out is accurate. And then those dots should match as well. Okay. So it's fiddly. I'm going to say it's easy, but this is why you're matching the outside edges, but at that 1 centimetre seam allowance it will match. So I'll start the sewing so you can get an idea what it's going to look like. Yeah, so again you've got to, and it's at the opposite of the needle because you're sewing on a curve, that's what you're lining up to the 3/8 or the 1 centimetre. Unthread your needle. That's not working, is it? Old school threading. Okay. Alright, so you're lining up opposite again because you're going to be turning as you're sewing. It's just going to feel a little bit awkward, and probably have to keep the stitch length on the preset, which is quite small, because it'll be easier to go on the curve. So I'm turning it and I'm lining opposite my needle at the 1 centimetre, not worrying too much about what's going on on the front, and then turning around and just making sure that that's always lined up on the outside edge, and sewing my 1 centimetre seam allowance. And I will keep going all the way. Takes a little bit of time, making sure there's nothing in the way, hopefully no pleats or puckers, but having snipped that fabric first is allowing it to open out like it wants to. And you have to trust your pattern where you had it done on the sewing line is correct, the measurements, and it is just making sure that the seam allowance that you've added are spot on when cutting as well. But there's not many commercial patterns that do this, because in manufacturing this takes too much time, but for one-off bespoke garments, again you've got to just make sure. Might have a bit of a pucker in there, I just need to check that. So it might require a little bit of unpicking, or another snip in there. Help it lay flat. Should have been alright, I've got a slight issue there, but we shall see what happens. And all the way round. All the way round. You could tack it first if that gave you more confidence. And I've just sewn up to that dot that I'd put on. I think I might have a slight issue, but what that gives you, oh no, I've gone exactly right, yeah, I've a slight little pucker there that I'll just go and unpick and redo. Tiny bit there, but not much. Might be able to press that out a little bit. Yeah. But I will just undo that bit and re-sew that one, but you can see when that's pressed, that's then giving you that curved shape, and it's got the bust dart fit in it, and why it's quite complicated to sew a curve. And it's important because you have to snip that outer edge to allow it to lay open as you sew, but the two sewing lines are the same. Okay.